Crisis? What crisis? Manchester United 3, Southampton 0. In the end, a really decent performance, a very positive result, and exactly what Manchester United needed, exactly what the doctor ordered. So all in all, a very good afternoon for Erik ten Hag and his men. But it didn't necessarily look like that for the first 30 minutes, because early on in the game, there were problems. And this is why I think we need to break this game down properly, because there are things that people are not talking about online. Erik ten Hag makes a change halfway through this game, which for me changes the dynamic of the football match. So let's start off with the first half hour, where I think most people would agree Southampton was certainly on top. They were the better team, and United looked a little bit sluggish. It started off with Southampton playing out from the back. And of course, Manchester United wanted to apply pressure. Some people are saying that United abandoned the high press and sat really deep, but I don't think that was the case. I just think the early high press was poor, so it almost looked non-existent. So how did it work? Early on, we saw Xerxes and Bruno Fernandes, who we kind of often label as a front two out of possession, but they didn't really operate in that way. It was more of like a 1-1 situation, because what we would see is often one of them picking up a centre-back like this, and the other one would pick up a deeper central midfielder, often Flynn Downs in this position. But actually what would happen as the play went across, we often left the other centre-back too open. We would see the far side winger having to come in to try and deal with this, but this player is then 2v1'd and Southampton can move their way out from the back. And we have an incredibly early example of this. This is 1 minute into the game. You can see Xerxes and Bruno here. They're not really quite a front two, are they? They are that 1-1 shape. And you're going to see as Bruno Fernandes applies pressure, Xerxes hangs out a little bit on the midfielder, and Rashford is forced into a pretty narrow position. He is inside here. Which means that eventually as the ball gets played across, we can see Xerxes still tied up in midfield, but what we can see is that Marcus Rashford has a 2v1 situation here against him, and that is not ideal. And that is why, early on in the game, Southampton found it, to be honest, incredibly easy to move the ball out from the back. They found it really easy. Now, as a result, from there, United then had to collapse back into more of a 4-4-2 or a 4-2-4 mid-block. This is why it looks like United abandoned the high press. They didn't actually. They just didn't press well, so were eventually forced into this sort of position, where, again for the first 30 minutes, United had a lot of problems. The main problem being the rotations out wide down Manchester United's left or Southampton's right hand side. Marcus Rashford and Ahmad are in these sort of half and half positions, where they're not quite in the forward line up here, but they're not quite in the midfield line back here. They are sort of in between. And with Manchester United now being a little bit passive out of possession, giving Southampton a bit of time on the ball, Southampton started to kind of pull Manchester United players out of position, stringing passes together, and they were actually playing some really good football. The main problem was, when the ball could be moved into these areas in here, the ability for Southampton to then get players behind Marcus Rashford. We know that Rashford doesn't track back with a great intensity, but it's not entirely his fault, because structurally he is starting higher, and it is difficult for him to therefore turn and actually track this runner. And this led to countless situations in the first half where Dalot, for a few seconds at a time, was in a 1 versus 2 situation. Now, Dalot had an incredibly poor first half hour. So bad, his worst game in a long time. But I don't want to heap too much criticism on him, because I actually think the system was kind of setting him up for failure. It's difficult for almost any player to deal with a 1v2 on a regular basis, and this caused a problem. The other problem was, with Rashford struggling to get back and track down this side, at times Dalot was caught coming out into these areas, applying pressure onto someone like Dibbling in midfield. But let's say if Fernandes has got the ball here, it meant that a ball could then be hooked into the channel, and Southampton done a really good job of dragging our centre-backs out wide into 1 versus 1 situations. So again, United were in a mid-block shape, but it was far too easy to penetrate. Going around the outside, it was really easy for Southampton to move the ball forward. And ultimately, that first half, to me, felt like Erik ten Hag's first season in a way, because we ended up sitting quite deep with a lot of players behind the ball. We were extremely reliant on our 2 centre-backs, although, to be honest, I thought Lisandro Martinez and De Ligt were phenomenal. I thought the 2 of them were absolutely brilliant. De Ligt got done in 1 versus 1 in the box against Walker Peters. I have expressed concerns over that in the past. But generally speaking, I think the 2 of them were absolutely fantastic. There were also resemblances to Erik ten Hag's first season, because we were pretty reliant in the transition. Now, the good thing is, United have got players that are good there. You know, we've got Eriksen who can play the passes. We've got Marcus Rashford who's a brilliant runner. We had Xerxes coming in and linking the play, creating room for Marcus Rashford to go into. I like that. We have Bruno Fernandes who can play the passes. Ahmad, who is a brilliant two-way threat. He carries the ball well. He can go left. He can go right. He knows when to keep the ball. So United were dangerous in transition in the first half. You would argue United were lucky to be 2-0 up. I think ultimately the Onana penalty save was a turning point. United typically would go 1-0 down there, and it could be a very different day. But instead it's 0-0. Manchester United scored 2 goals from set pieces. Shout out to De Ligt and Marcus Rashford. Brilliant goals. But actually, you could make an argument United didn't deserve to have that lead because United didn't play very well in the first half. I thought on the ball we were fine. The problem was our press was bad, then our mid-block was bad, so our centre-backs had to do a lot of work. In the second half, we saw a change. So I have already seen a lot of people talking about the change of Manchester United in the second half of the game. And again, I think everyone would agree. It was a much better performance in the second half. Granted, it was only 1 goal, but generally speaking, it was much improved. I think people would say United were in control of the game, and that was actually reflected in the possession. Manchester United went up to 61% possession in the second half of the game. So United were controlled, and we will talk about the in-possession side shortly. But actually, I think the in-possession stuff was okay in the first half as well. The big change in the second half for me was the change in the out-of-possession approach. You see, if you can control a game out of possession, you can win the ball higher up the pitch. You are doing less defensive work in your own penalty area. Instead, you're doing it high up the pitch or around the halfway line. Then you can get the ball, and then when you've got players on the pitch like Eriksen, like Kobbie Mainoo, like Mazraoui, who are willing to slow it down, then you dominate the ball. But it only happens because of the press. So what was the change in the press? First of all, the wingers were tasked with doing something a little bit different. Rather than playing this sort of in-between position here, they were held a little bit wider, more like a man-to-man approach with the 2 fullbacks. We also saw a change with our front 2 though, in the sense that for me, it more regularly actually became a front 2. We would more often see Xerxes on one centre-back, whilst Bruno Fernandes would come a little bit higher. Now the reason that United were able to do this was because Kobbie Mainoo was allowed to move higher, Eriksen was willing to do so as well, but also Lisandro Martinez was aggressive, stepping out of his back line into midfield. Now, I have made comments about Lich's start to the season not being too great. I thought in this game again he was brilliant. His defensive work was so good. But this is what changed the game in my opinion. The out of possession work. You can see it here. It's a bit more of a front 2. These 2 are no longer in a 1-1 situation. They are with each other high in the press. You can see we've also got Ahmad fairly high up the pitch on Kyle Walker-Peters. But the important thing is, Bruno Fernandes isn't so connected to the midfield anymore. It is more of that front 4. I thought it was a clearer pressing structure in the second half. And you can see Kobbie Mainoo and Christian Eriksen willing to back it up in the middle of the pitch. And suddenly, you can go into your duels like this. You can go into your battles. We're much closer to Southampton. We didn't really do this at all in the first half. Not this high up the pitch, because we couldn't get close enough. Now, eventually, Southampton actually keep the ball well, and they play the ball backwards pretty well. But what United can then do from here is be aggressive with the positioning. Bruno Fernandes is still high. Xerxes is still high up the pitch. What we saw in the first half was one of those front 2 collapsing back onto a midfielder. They might have been on someone like Flynn Downs in this position over here. But instead, Bruno stayed high. And then eventually, we can force Southampton to one side of the pitch. Again, in the first half, Bruno would then drop deeper onto Downs in this position. That was Bruno's role in the first half, dropping onto the midfielder. But in the second half, United were much more aggressive, and actually that was now Eriksen's man, and Bruno Fernandes was allowed to stay high, closer to the centre-back, and we properly locked Southampton to one side of the pitch. And then because we were doing this, we were able to win the ball high on a more regular basis, and we were also able to do that because, like I said, these players were connecting the press from these deeper positions. As a result, United won the ball much higher up the pitch, and then we done something really clever when we got the ball, almost groundbreaking you could argue. We slowed the game down. We controlled the ball, and genuinely, I would say, we showed impressive game management. Like I said, it helps when you've got your Mazraoui on the pitch, your Kobbie Mainoo, your Eriksen, the players that want to take a few extra touches on the ball. Obviously, Dalot is always one as well. But United just settled themselves into a really nice rhythm and just completely dominated the game. And Southampton didn't have a sniff in the second half. Not a single chance created. And Manchester United, on the other hand, were actually still quite good going forward. In this more settled shape, we were taking our time, we weren't forcing the ball, we were manipulating the game quite well. We could draw the ball onto one side, and I think Ahmad and Mazraoui look brilliant together. The way that they interchange is really quite exciting. I think there's a lot there. But again, Xerxes, I thought was phenomenal with his link play. He needs to add the goals, but that will come. The finishing will improve. But the link play was so good. And I also thought Marcus Rashford was much improved on the left-hand side. Given more license to come inside when Dalot would overlap him, it just worked much nicer. And in general, United just looked much calmer in that second half. Because the defensive work was done so much higher up the pitch, when we then got the ball, our players were close to each other. And I tell you what, we've got some technicians this season. Players that want to play close to each other and play quick passing football, quick interchanges, movement to support each other. It was really impressive. And of course, also, game state comes into play as well. Southampton are 2-0 down. They need to chuck players forward. They need to try and chase a goal. And then it opens the game up. And United always have the transition threat. Rashford again, Xerxes, Bruno, Ahmad, Garnacho from the bench. We know how dangerous that is. He is so good as an impact player. And in the end, it turns into a pretty good day for Manchester United. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say it was perfect. The first half an hour was really poor, and United should have been behind. And another day probably would have been. But we got through that stumbling block, and after that, I genuinely think it was a pretty good performance. Far from perfect, but today we are just going to cover the positives, because there have been plenty of games recently where we have covered the negatives. So today, a focus on the positives. Ten Hag made that little tweak, the team was more aggressive, more controlled, and ultimately put in a pretty good performance, and got 3 points with 3 goals. All in all, I'm pretty happy, but that's just my thought. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, let me know your opinions. But apart from that, we are finished for today. So thank you guys for watching. Hope you have enjoyed it. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.